Yes, absolutely. All right. So people are joining. Let me just talk a bit about the schedule while folks are getting here. So here we are today at 3:17. So we're going to do the first part of Chapter 8 today and the next part next week. Then there will be no class for 2 weeks. This is spring break, and this is when I'll be in Southern California at a conference, and then we pick up again on the 14th. So that's the plan. Now let's carry on with Chapter 8A here. So this is pretty dense stuff in the book. You probably noticed. I try and pick out the good parts. One thing that's funny is they start the chapter by saying you should know about the TEB and the PEB, and then they don't tell you anything about it. So I went and looked it up on Wikipedia, added it to my slides because I didn't know anything about it. We'll talk about that and Stack Overflows and defeating ASLR and move on to SEH protections, including the Server 2008 defenses that are not in your textbook because your textbook is really quite old. It is the Bible in this business. It's still important to know, but it doesn't have the modern Windows defenses. So we'll talk about that. So the TEB and the PEB are parts of Windows executable. And what this is, the TEB, all CPU time in Windows is allocated to threads. Every process is broken into threads, and each thread has a thread environment block. And this is sort of the memory map of the thread. So it's officially undocumented, partially documented, but people have figured it out. So they have effectively become part of the API, not because Microsoft officially wanted people using them, but people figured it out and they all just started using it, which is true of a lot of Windows software. And this creates one of the crazy things about Windows software, which continues right up to the current point. When Microsoft patched Meltdown Inspector, they had trouble because a lot of software like antivirus apps did not obey Microsoft rules because people have just used reverse engineering techniques to figure out how to do things in Windows without Microsoft's blessing, and that has become a habit to that's the normal way they write software. So it's sort of out of control. So the TEB tells you a lot about the process. It can show you the error, the import address table, startup arguments, and so on. And it starts with an SEH pointer. Now, there are a couple of registers in the processor that we've hardly ever talked about. We talk about the EAX and the EIP and the ESP and EBP, but there are a couple other registers at the bottom we never talk about, FS and GS, the file F segment and the G segment. And these were actually intended in much earlier versions of processors to contain pointers to memory regions. And they're not used much now, but they are used here. The FS pointer points to the thread environment block. So FS plus 0 gives you the SEH frame, and then you have the bottom of the stack and the top of the stack. So it's sort of the memory map of a thread and pointed to by the FS segment. Of course, it's living. The things it points to are living in memory, but the FS segment, it points to where it starts, just like the ESP points to the top of the stack. All right, so that's what these things are. So the process environment block is you are not supposed to look at it directly. You're supposed to call Windows API calls to mess with it. The fields are for internal use. And again, Microsoft didn't intend for other people to use them, but people have figured it out. And let me, by the way, I should mute people because I think my automatic muting still doesn't work. Thought I got it, but I don't think I was able to get it. I've had various students try to help, but my theory is it just doesn't work. Anyway, so we talked about stack-based buffer overflows for Linux, and in Windows it's similar. You overflow a variable, you go right to the end of the stack frame, you find the stored EIP, and you overwrite that. You change that to an address that will point back to a NOP sled in the code you injected. So it looks like this. You have a variable called name. You overflow with more than 20 bytes of data. Then in that mess, you put in a NOP sled. Here's the egg that you get from MSF Venom that's going to do your payload. Then you have padding as necessary to get down to the stored return value. And in this stored return value, you put an address in your NOP sled, and then you can take over the machine. This is the classic Alice null buffer overflow exploit. Now, there are other techniques. One of them is to overwrite the structured exception handler. If you do that, then you do not control the EIP directly. You change the pointer to the exception handlers. Now you have to trigger an exception. Do something illegal that will trigger the exception handler, and then you get in. So that's this one. You write into the exception registration record, then you trigger an exception. And when you do, it'll jump down to this handler, and you point that to your NOP sled. It's not that different than what we did before when we targeted the global offset table, which is the return to libc. So if you want to defeat address space layout randomization, then you've got this situation where every process is randomly placed in memory, so you can still overthrow something and you can still change the EIP, but you don't know what number to put there because you have no idea where you are in memory. So one way to do this is to not inject an address directly. Instead, you find a jump ESP and you go there. So you trampoline. You find somewhere in the Windows code a jump EIP and a jump ESP, and you jump there, and then that goes to wherever the stack is. That's a common trick. Another way to do it is to use the SEH. Older Windows versions always just left the address of the structured instruction handler in EBX. So this kind of, right. And therefore, you could just look in EBX to find out what to overwrite. The newer versions clear all the registers to try to fix that, but they didn't do a very good job, because if you look on the stack, at the moment of an exception, all you have to do is move 2 words down to ESP +8, and you'll find the address of the structured exception handler there. So now you don't find jump EBX, you find pop return. And that will move down 4, move down another 4, and then put that value in the extended instruction pointer. So that pattern, pop return, will get you into the will get you into your code. Yeah.
If it's like the jump ES.
Yeah.
How do you get it in your code to do it?
You have to find the address of a jump ESP that doesn't move. So you find it in part of some Windows code that is doesn't have ASLR turned on. That's an easy way to do it.
But then you point to that, jump to that, and then
yeah.
Going back to your stack, and then somehow you fill up your stack.
Well, you fill up the stack the same old way. You have a stack buffer overflow exploit. So you fill up the stack this way, but you jump, it's not shown in this arrow, but you trampoline off that jump ESP to come back down. And that way you don't need to know where the stack is. It will go to wherever the stack is. Yeah.
Which version of Windows stopped doing that?
I think it was XP Service Pack 1, but I'm not quite sure.
Can you give an example of, can you go back to the other slide?
Yeah.
Can you give an example of a jump ESP that doesn't have an ASLR turned on, that like would be, like, do you just have to like find one, or is there an example? I
don't know one offhand, but you can find them. And we'll be doing it a little later when we get to the demonstration. You can totally see them in Immunity. You can just list them out. We'll do it with Mona. All right. So pop ret does a similar thing. And then there's frame-based exception handlers. So here, the whole point, this is how Microsoft handles illegal instructions, like a divide by 0. Each frame has an exception handler, and each thread has at least one frame-based exception handler. So you've got the address of the first structure here at FS0, and there are others pointing to later ones, and this creates a bunch of exception handlers, which are in a linked list. So it walks through the list. It tries the first exception handler, and that exception handler returns a value saying whether it was able to handle the exception or not. And if it isn't able to handle the exception, it returns and tries the next one and the next one, trying to handle the exception. And of course, if they all fail, it will default to the operating system. So here's an example code to do this. It's going to try to cause this is going to cause an exception by setting EAX to 0 and then trying to jump to that as an executable address, which is not legal. So that'll create an exception handler. You create an exception handler here. It will now go in here and exit 1. So this exception will jump into here without having a go-to or a return or anything. It will stop and go down here. And it will only go down there if it doesn't succeed in handling the exception.
The call 0 is an exception override by 0.
Yeah, call 0 is just an illegal address. It's not in the text section. You can't execute code there. Yeah. Like the one we often have is 41, 41, 41, 41, another address that is generally illegal. All right, you can view it in Immunity. Just view the SEH chain. I opened Notepad in Immunity, and you just see a series of addresses here, all in NTDIL. These are the exception handlers for Notepad. If you cause a crash inside Notepad, it'll try these things in order. So you can follow that address in the stack, and you'll find the pointer to the next SEH record here. So it jumps through them. All right, so if you overflow the stack and change the return address, you have, of course, damaged other things in the process. You've damaged the stored EBP, and you've probably overwritten other variables. So this is likely to create exceptions. Typical Stack Overflow does quite a lot of collateral damage. And we've seen that if you remember the Linux exploits where you're trying to get like a you win message, you'll often get that message, but then it crashes because you didn't really repair all the damage you did getting to the EIP. We were working after class one day, figured out how to carefully overwrite it to fix the damage so you don't get that. So if you want to get control of the exception handling, you have to find the exception handler. And before Windows XP SP1, you could just look in EBP, and that would point you there. After that, all the registers are zeroed when the SEH is called in order to make this more difficult. But what you do is just this, like I said, you'll find the pointer to the exception handler, two EBX points here into the exception handler. That's the old one. Yeah, that's the old one was. So at the crash, EBX points to the exception handler. So all you have to do is execute a jump EBX to get into the exception handler, which, yeah.
You put a jump bypass a pointer. So you have to overwrite it.
Yes. You have to overwrite it with an address that points to jump EBX. So you change the exception handler so that instead of doing whatever it would do, it'll go someplace that has a jump EBX. So you have to find a jump EBX somewhere in the code you can point to. And here's the modern Windows program. When you have a crash, it will, the third number down, 17CEF4, is going to be the exception handler. So now if you want to get to the exception handler, you get there with pop return. So if you can find code that does that, then that will get you into the exception handler. All right. So there are protections to prevent these attacks. In Windows 2003, it does these steps. If it looks and finds that the handler is pointing to an address on the stack, that's invalid. The handler should be pointing to things like NTDIL or something inside your code. If it's pointing in the stack, that's not executable code. You shouldn't be going there. So it will look at the stack addresses, and if it's between these two addresses, it will not go there anymore. This is Microsoft's attempt to prevent this particular attack in 2003. If the handler is inside an ASIN or DIL, it might accept that. There's other complicated conditions of when it will take it. But if it doesn't read those, it'll take it. Call it valid. If the module is marked not allowed, it's invalid. And this may look familiar if you remember other Windows defenses. Microsoft Windows used to have a technology called ActiveX. And ActiveX put compiled code in the browser, and Microsoft had to deal with that. So what they did was they put a safe flag in the ActiveX controls to try to mark the ones that were unsafe. So you could get around it just by putting a safe flag in your malicious ActiveX control. But this is the kind of control Microsoft often does. They just put some kind of defense, which is trivial to bypass, but it does mean that a whole generation of previous malware will stop working. And so here's another one. If the module has no load configuration directory or the module is small enough, it'll let you jump into it. Obviously, what they're trying to do here is they're trying to prevent the attack without breaking too much legacy code. Remember, since people are not being controlled, they will do stupid things like jump halfway through a routine. In later versions of Windows, as we'll see, you will only let them start a module at the start. That would make sense. But some programmers have written code that does jump into the middle of things. And if you outlaw that, then you break that old code. Anyway, so here's the ways to exploit the structured extraction handler on Windows Server. You can just take an existing handler and trick it into running your code. If you can find some code you control in there, you can use code in an address outside all modules. If you can find code like that and trust it, or you can find a module that doesn't have a load configuration directory, and then it will regard jumping anywhere in that module as valid.
What is the load configuration?
Just some kind of structure that you're supposed to have in an exception handler, and apparently some of them don't have it. Some processes don't have it. So, all right, in Server 2008, Microsoft tried to raise the bar again. So here's a normal SEH attack. You have an exception, you call the handler, and up here, you're now going to do, remember, this pop return, which is going to get you back into the code you injected. I'm not able to go through this in the details, but the safe SEH is a compiler switch, and what this does is it creates a whitelist of handler addresses. And this is something Microsoft has done many times. So if you recompile your old code with the new switch, now you cannot jump into the middle of modules. You can only jump into the safe places, which would prevent this kind of attack. SE-hop is another one. This is not like stacked cookies, which we'll talk about next time. The SE-hop verifies that the handler is intact. It checks that all the handlers are proper linked list, which means none of them can be pointing off somewhere stupid. That's the game here. It's like a heap overflow. If you overflow one handler, you typically damage the next one. And so the linked list doesn't work. Cisco uses a similar process to protect their routers. They walk the heaps. There's a thing called check heaps that hops through the heap and then hops back to make sure the heap is still intact. And if it isn't, it reboots the router. So this is it verifies the integrity of it. And if there's been any overflows, you'll be damaging addresses and you'll break that integrity. So here's the exception registration record, which looks like this. And you have, remember, you have two pointers. You have a pointer to the next and a pointer to the handler. And if you've been overwriting things to try to put the value here in the handler, then you've damaged the next on the way there. So the link walking through the list will not work anymore. All right. So here's how it works. It adds an extra registration record at the end. It walks through the handler and makes sure it gets to the one it put at the end. That means the whole list is intact and none of those pointers point off somewhere stupid. All right. So here's a valid chain where you have one handler and another handler and then the final handler going to each other. And here's an invalid chain where somebody overwrote this, trying to change that to make this point to some other code that will jump into their exploit. And that means they broke this pointer. So when you try to follow that pointer, you do not find the next registration record. So it goes off somewhere crazy. It never makes it to this final one, which Windows added. It adds this final one and makes sure it can get there. And it won't be able to get there if you've been overflowing things. That's the idea. All right. So Server 2008, it's enabled by default and disabled in Vista and disabled in Windows 7. This is quite common. Microsoft has a lot more defenses in the server versions of their operating system than in the client version. So you can turn on the server defenses, but a lot of them are turned off in client versions because client operating systems probably want to run legacy code, and they're not that critical. Servers, they turn on more defenses. Another thing you'll find is that client versions of Windows have many more drivers than servers. You can buy cheap hardware. It'll run in a client version of Windows. It will not run in a server because they don't include drivers that don't meet their full quality standards in the server, but they do in the client because a lot of people want to use cheap hardware and legacy code on clients. So here's, you can control this. You can turn it on and off. And you'll see it here. You can turn it on and off in the registry. You can turn it on and off by program. So you see here's Bowne server.exe, the program running on my server. And you can go here and adjust whether you want to disable exception change validation or not. You can control it on Windows 7. You can, on a program by program basis, choose to turn SE-hop on. What's that?
What you were disabling when you, on Windows 8 and above, you like restart and to allow unsigned, or like allow custom drivers or whatever?
No, unsigned device drivers. No, but it's a similar defense. Okay. On server operating systems, you can only use signed drivers, and on client versions, they permitted it. And if you boot in a special mode, it allows you to use unsigned drivers. And that's a similar issue. Right. Unsigned drivers typically come from cheap hardware. They're not recommended, and Microsoft makes it more and more difficult to use them because they're responsible for a lot of crashes. You can see a lot of Microsoft's general policies and how they implement these things. So if you really want to run legacy code, there's a way to do it, but they make it more and more difficult. So you'll find if you try to run these attacks on a machine with safe SEH, you'll get this answer: debug program was unable to handle exception, which means safe say caught it. It discovered that the exception handlers are no good, and that's why you see this message in the debugger. All right, so I got some Kahoots, and then I'm going to demonstrate some of this stuff. Or actually, we'll be going through Bowne server, which we're going to do a simpler kind of overflow today, but this other stuff will come up later in the projects. So we're here. Trying to get a signal. Should be able to connect to danger zone. If you want a cell phone signal, I think you have to open the window. This room is a Faraday cage. All right, I'll wait a few more seconds. All right. So what defense is enabled in servers but disabled in clients? All right, that's SE-HOP. Okay, which defense cannot protect legacy code? Safe SEH cannot do that because you have to recompile with the switch in a more modern version of Visual Studio. All right, which defense can be enabled individually for each process in Windows 7? Okay, that's SE-HOP and that registry key. All right, which exploit method only works before XP SP1? All right, EBX contained a useful value before Service Pack 1, then they cleared it. All right, which exploit method defeats ASLR for simple stack overflows? All right, you can do it with pop return in a modern machine. All right. I'm thinking some of these others would work too, depending on your version. All right. So where's the register pointing to the thread environment block? All right, that's FS. All right. So let me record this stuff, and then I want to just demonstrate some of these things. This is 127, tip, Kaz, and you'll have to tell me who King Papa is. Is that you? One of you? That's you?
Well, no.
Okay. All right. So let me just, let's take a look at this Bowne server. Demonstrate this one. All right, so here we had this program called Bowne server, and I'm running it in a debugger in Windows, so I'm just going to restart it. And now it's paused. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, it's always paused when you restart it in the debugger, so I run it now. Now it's listening. Now if I go to my Kali machine, which is under SSH control here, okay. So let me go to this window here. Make it bigger. All right. And wider. Okay. So make it as big as I can and make sure it's high enough so people can see it. Not all this junk popping up, getting in the way. Okay. So if I look at the VS fuzz, we looked at this briefly last time, and I want to go a little further into it now. So here's my server IP address and my port number. I'm going to send trun dot and then the attack, which is just going to be a bunch of capital A's. So that's all. If I send that to the server, let me move this up here so we can see the Windows machine behind it. Okay, so here's my debugger, and it's running. Let me move this over so it isn't cut off by the screen. Okay, and here is my attacker. Let me get rid of this one. Okay, so if I run this and I send 2,000 bytes, it crashes, and down here you can see it's an access violation when writing to 41414141. So I now have a write to an address I control, but it's not obvious that I control the data being written. So that is a vulnerability that could be exploited, but that's not the easiest one to exploit. So let's restart the server, debug, restart, yes, and then run it here. So it's listening again. If I just send the same attack of 3,000 long, I get a better answer. Now I get access violation when executing 41414141. So now I'm controlling the EIP directly, which is much easier to use than just a write. So I know an exploit length of 3,000 is good for me. Now let me go to my instructions. Let's get rid of this stuff. Okay. The next thing was to send a non-repeating pattern, and for that I used VS EIP0. There are some utilities built into Kali to create non-repeating patterns. I wasn't very interested in them. I just wrote my own. You can use them if you like. It's very easy to make a repeating pattern, a pattern of any site in Python. So this just goes through 0 to 5, 0 to 4 in ASCII. 0 to 4, and this goes from 0 to 9, and this goes from 0 to 9. So it's going to print 4 characters each time, and that's going to be a number that counts up to 500 followed by A. So let's just run this one. I can show you what it does. VSEIP0. See if it's executable. It is. That's all it does. It prints 000A, 001A, 002A, and so on. So if I put this in a 32-bit register, I'll get 4 characters, and that will uniquely tell me where I am. And the length of the whole thing is 500 times 4, 2,000 bytes. Now remember, my attack is 3,000 bytes long. So I've assumed that the overflow is somewhere towards the end. So I just, let me get rid of the colors. All I do is, there we go. All right, so I put in 1,000 A's. Then I put in that pattern of 2,000, and then I just put out both of those things, the prefix plus the characters. So if the overflow is in the last 2,000 bytes, I'll see it. So let's run that one. Let me go back to my Windows machine and debug, restart, and run it again. And go back to here and run that code. Let me get this back out of here so it quits hiding what I need to see. Okay, that keeps on doing that. Every time I leave, I have to press a key press to get out of here. And the stinking Windows machine keeps hearing it. Okay. EIP1. So that's what I wanted to see. It now had a violation when executing this number, 35, 32, 41, 31. So that is 52A1 in ASCII, because 31 is 1 and 41 is A. So I made a little diagram here so you can see it. It is there. That is it, 1A25. See, I make it big enough to see, because that's where it hit, in the middle of that stuff. So I can figure out where that is. So it's after, and I worked it out, and it's after 2006 bytes in the stack comes that. So let me target the EIP precisely with VS EIP 2. And that's this one. All right, get rid of the colors, make it bigger. So what I did, I figured out it was 2006 bytes in to hit the EIP. So I put in 2006 of these, then I put in B, C, D, E, and then I put in enough padding to make the total length 3,000. Because remember, an attack that was only 2,000 long hit a different crash, not the crash I want. So I want to keep the total length always the same. So that's what this one does. And if I've done it right, it will put B, C, D, E in the stack pointer. So let's restart it here. Debug, restart. And run here. And run it here. Okay, and now I get what I wanted to get. It crashed when executing 42, 43, 44, 45, which is B, C, D, E. So now I control the EIP. Now, the next thing I got to do is look at the memory when this happens. See, now I know I can control the EIP, and I need to figure out where to go. So here is the ESP, and you can see right here, it's followed by FFFF. So it's somewhere in the end of my attack, because what I did was put in 2006 A's, then a B, C, D, E, and then a bunch of F's. And I can find out exactly where by either, I could just scroll up here to see the stack, or I can dump it here with right-click, follow and dump. Either way works. If I go up there, you'll see it's right at the start. So what happened is I put in a bunch of A's, 2,000 A's, then I put in B, C, D, E, and I'll try to make this bigger. All right, then I have B, C, D, E, then I have the F's, and right now the ESP points right here. So I can put my exploit code right there. And if I can find a jump ESP, I can run it. So that's handy. So now I have to find bad characters. Here's the ones I would commonly expect to be bad, and I test for them by inserting bad characters in early part of the exploit and see if they get through. So I'm not going to go through that because it's kind of boring, but you do have to do it. And once you've done that, you find several bad characters. And the next thing we have to do is find jump ESP or push ESP return in order to jump that ESP, because we're going to view this on a machine with address space layout randomization turned on. So we have to use Mona. Now, I think I've already got Mona on here. Let me try it. Bang Mona. Error importing module. All right, maybe I'm going to have to install it, which I thought I already had done, but we will see. All right, download mona.py and then put it. All right. Let me just get it here. And yeah, let's see if I can get it from here, because it won't be 7-zipped. There's mona.py. Okay. Well, clicking the link seems to, oh, there it is. Okay. I need to download it, and instead I'm getting stupid things. I need to right click the raw link. Okay. And save as. There we are. Okay. That's putting it somewhere. Let's put it in downloads instead of somewhere stupid. Okay. All right. So now I have mona.py, and I need to put it in the right directory. So let's start by putting it on the desktop. Okay. I don't know why I'm there, finally. Okay. There. Okay, so now I've got it there. Now let me find out where to put it. It's in some folder that's sort of annoying to find. I would close that if I could. There's not right now. Okay. It's C program files, immunity, py commands. Okay. So come on, let me out of here. Okay. All right. C program files, or is it program files x86? But this is not a 64-bit. It's program files, immunity debugger, Pi commands. That's where I need to put it. Okay. So let's find it. There it is. Okay. Okay. Now when I restart immunity, it should be there. Okay. There. Okay, now I should be able to run bang moto down here. Yes. Okay. Now, let's see if I can make this at all visible. Appearance, font, system fixed. Okay, that makes it as big as I can. So Mona has a lot of commands. Mona is fantastic. Before this, it would actually take you like half an hour to do this return-oriented programming. So let's show Mona and all its joy. You can see the modules here in your program. So let me load my program, which is Bowne server, which should be right here. Okay, now I can do Mona modules. And there they are. This is where we really get down to the good stuff. So over here, let me make my window as wide as I can. This is a big problem with all of this kind of work. You have so many details that you need a high resolution monitor and it's hard to project. So here are modules, and let me see if I can, over here on the right, you can see this is a DIL file, and this is ESS func, and this is Bowne server itself, and you can see what defenses are turned on. So this is safe SEH, this is ASLR, and this is NX, which is data execution prevention. And those are powerful defenses. But what you do is you find code that is not using them, like Bowne server itself. Bowne server is legacy code, and all the good defenses are turned off. So we can reuse code in Bowne server, and we won't have to hunt around for it. Now, here's another thing. We could look for Bowne server itself, though. We're not going to be able to use it because the addresses are all going to start with 0. Bowne server is loaded from 004,000 to 00400,000. All the addresses have null bytes in them. So we're going to do better to go to this essfunc.dil, which I think is also part of Bowne server. It's a DIL file it uses. That is loaded at 625 million or something, and those addresses don't all contain zeros. We can find code here with usable addresses, and that's the point. So those are your modules. Now, we want to find useful hex codes. So in Kali, this is the way I did it. There turns out there's a more modern way in the version of Mona to do this, but at this time I just did it by finding binary code. So I used Kali, a simple compiler, to show that a jump ESP is FFE4. And this will look literally for FFE4 in that function, essfunc.dil, and that'll work. There is a more modern version of the command that looks for more variations of the code, but this is good enough for what we're doing right now. What's that?
On your, go back to the other screen you're at, so like how did you know it was going to be FFE4 instead of E4FF?
Oh, that's the order. You can see it has to be FFE4. FFE4 is all one command. Okay. The one command, jump ESP, is 2 bytes of machine language, and it has to be FFE4. If it was E4FF, it would be a different command. Okay. And you can, if you go to a simple language program, you'll see there's a mnemonic as a code and the parameters are code. And you just go to like the Intel assembly language reference manual to find out what the mnemonics are. But that's what this program, NASM Shell, does. It shows you what the code is. You could also, if you had code, if you had a program that had this code, you could see it in like any debugger or disassembler. But notice we used Linux to get the code for Windows because this is an assembly language. It's the same in everything. It's hardware. The hardware is what determines this. It's FFE4 in the Intel processor. That's a good question. All right, so I've got this thing, and I wanted to put it here. It's supposedly my clipboard. Let's see. It is. So that's going to find the locations of this and see it found like 7 or 9 places I could use. Here's the address. Notice the address doesn't contain any zeros, and it's got an FFE4 there. So I can just jump to this address, and that address will not move because ASLR is turned off for this thing. And so I can trampoline. So this is the point is I want to jump to the stack I injected, which is randomly jumping around in memory. To get there, I jump to a module that doesn't move, that has a jump ESP, and it trampolines back into the code wherever it is. So ASLR doesn't save me. That's the point of this. All right. So the next question is, do you have code execution? Because remember, we've had this happen in Linux where you inject NOPs, and when you jump there, the NOPs won't run because code execution is turned off. So let's do this VSEIP3, which is here in this one. All right, let's see, I thought I had it. Maybe I'm gonna have to add it in here. All right, I'm going to take just this part of it because my server address is different and put it in VSEIP3. Okay, so I copy VSEIP2 to VSEIP3. All right, get rid of the colors. I said get rid of the colors, there we go. Okay, now paste in that junk. Get rid of all this junk, although it doesn't really matter down below the close. Okay, and let's talk about this attack. So here, I connect to my server. Here I put in the 2006 A's, which is just padding to get me to the place where I can eject the EIP. Then I put in this value for the EIP, which I got from Mona. So that's going to go to some code that doesn't move, that goes jump ESP. Now I know from before the ESP is going to point to the next byte after the EIP, so I put my NOP sled there. 16 bytes of this, then I put in a bunch of breaks, one break, and then I put in enough padding. So if this is working, it will slide down the NOP sled and hit the break. If data execution prevention stops it, it will stop at the first 90. That's what happens here. So let's save that. That's VSEIP3. And if I go here and run my Bowne server again, let me go back to the CPU, which is the main window you look at here, and then debug, restart, and run. And then go to here, and let me see if there's any way to get that off the screen. Hold this down and count to 10 or something is what I have to do to get VMware to stop sending that to the wrong machine. Okay. Okay, so now see what happens. It hit the int3 command. By the way, I should mention when you're doing projects, sometimes students are turning in screenshots and you can't see this because this only shows for a few seconds and then it vanishes. If you want to see that message and it's gone, you can view the log, window logs. Everything goes in the log. There's the last thing that happened was the int3 command. I just thought I'd mention that in case you get tired of those messages vanishing before you can read them. Anyway, so now we are here, we hit this, and if you scroll up, you'll see we hit the int3. So this is the NOP sled. So here's the structure of our attack that we just fed in. Here it fed in the address. The address went to a jump ESP, and that worked because I came back here and hit these NOPs, and I slid down those NOPs until I hit the int3, and I executed it, and it stopped after the int3, and this is an F, because I just put Fs after it all. So I have, my stack is executable. I don't have to overcome that problem. And that means the rest of the exploit is pretty much just mechanical. All I have to do now is prepare, put a real exploit in there. So you go into MSF Venom and make a real exploit. The only bad character was 0 in this case. So you make a real attack code and inject it in there, and then you'll be able to make a shell and connect to it just like before. So that is return-oriented programming to overcome ASLR. And I was talking about that earlier in the lecture. This is where you make a trampoline. You find some code that doesn't move, that will jump to a register value that contains the code you need, and it'll find it and run it. That's why, you know, all these defenses are just temporary. They just mean you have to put a little more work into the exploit, and within a couple of years, everybody finds a new way to get past it, and there's another generation of malware. But around the time Microsoft developed this, they also started really cooperating with the hacking community, and now they have the Blue Hat Conference every year where they invite hackers to come, and they will pay you something like $50,000 or $100,000 for a new attack, and they will pay you another $50,000 or $100,000 if you write the defense that stops it. And most of the modern heap defenses in modern versions of Windows were written by attackers, who then wrote a defense that would stop those attacks. So this is why if you go to DEF CON, if you submit a talk, they'll put right in the template for submitting a talk, they say, if you're proposing a new attack, what is the defense? And if you're proposing a new defense, what is the attack that gets over it? Because that's the way it is. That's just an endless escalation. So that's what I wanted to show you. And if you keep going beyond Project 9, I think in Project 10, you'll be using this, later on, we'll be using one of these structured exception handler attacks. It's either in 10 or 11. Anyway, are there any questions? One thing, I was hoping somebody would tell me who won the Kahoot. Somebody named King Papa won. If you want your points, you got to tell me, but maybe no one cares. All right. If there aren't any questions, I'll just stop the share and I'll go upstairs and see what's happening. By the way, I recommend doing the CTF. There's a Angstrom CTF now, and it's very good. And there are a lot of it. If you do the binary and reverse engineering challenges in Angstrom CTF, it's very appropriate for this class, right at the right level. In fact, like the fourth reverse engineering is a format string that I'm sort of halfway through doing. Could very well be one of these homeworks. So check it out.
What is that?
Angstrom CTF. It's on my homepage. It's a capture the flag contest. And it's one of the high school oriented ones, so it's not insanely difficult. Believe it or not, everything I'm teaching you here is apparently high school level for viewpoint of compared to real industry. This is Angstrom CTF. And just make an account, make a team, and you can do these here, and there's a lot of fun ones. And it's worth extra credit in my classes, and it's also good for you. Yeah?
The high schools do pretty good on these competitions.
They do very well. They always beat all of us. And I don't know where they're learning it, because they don't teach this stuff in high school, but they have clubs apparently, and they're teaching themselves. Like I know Stanford beats us, and they don't have any classes. They learn it all out of outside classes.
They don't have any security classes?
Not at the undergraduate level. I don't think they do.
There's an article recently about the little kids. You got another question about outside of this topic?
Yeah.
One of your links talking about the lawyers and stuff, not knowing about crypto. And one of the links, right? And one of the links is talking about a way of searching through encrypted data and selectively doing it. You know?
Yeah. I've heard the idea a few times. This is homomorphic encryption. There is an idea, where you can encrypt data and then use it without decrypting it. This is kind of insane. This is what some privacy advocates want the NSA to do. What they do now is they sweep up all the email and phone calls in America, and then they get a court order giving you a chance to look at one guy. Then they do a query and find all this stuff, and then they supposedly only look at the stuff they're supposed to look at. But there's no way to prevent that. What they want to do is use some kind of encryption. Supposedly you can encrypt stuff in such a way that you can search for a keyword while it's encrypted and get the encrypted records that contain the keyword and then only decrypt those records. That's what they want. They feel like that procedure would be less open to abuse. It sounds kind of nuts to me, but anyway, that's the idea. The homomorphic encryption is this idea that you can use encrypted data without decrypting it. And there are some encryption schemes that make some of that possible, but I don't think anybody's using it in any practical way yet. Another issue that's similar is if you have Dropbox and you save a file in your Dropbox, the reason Dropbox has a free version is because 1 million people save the same file and they only store 1 copy. So they have to know what you got. And if your stuff was encrypted, they wouldn't know that. So they'd have to store 1 million copies if 1 million people save the same file. So another case where homomorphic encryption would be good for them. If somehow they can tell that the encrypted files are all the same and they only need to save 1 copy. Even if they couldn't open the file, there are encryption routines that have that property, where even when different people save it, there is some way to tell that they're all the same file. So these are pretty esoteric encryption issues, but there are people developing those techniques. And none of them are in use, I think, yet. But it might be a good thing in the future. Anyway, okay, I'm going to stop the share. I'll go upstairs and help anybody who wants to work here for a while, and I'll post these videos today. Last week I was a little late posting the videos, but I'll do it today so you won't have to wait. All right. If you go